The rain was coming down in sheets that November morning, the kind of cold, relentless rain that soaked through everything and turned the world gray. Harold Jensen stood on the front porch of the house he'd lived in for 67 years, watching two sheriff's deputies carry his furniture out to the curb. His recliner, the one with the worn armrest where his hand had rested through decades of evening news broadcasts. The kitchen table where he and his wife Rose had eaten breakfast every morning for 43 years of marriage. The bed frame they'd bought in 1957, solid oak, heavy enough that the deputies were struggling with it, cursing under their breath as the rain made everything slippery. Harold was 101 years old. He was wearing the same brown cardigan he wore every day, and his hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from something else. Something that felt like his entire life was being dismantled in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The eviction notice said he had to be out by noon. It was 11:15, and Harold had nowhere to go. But then a woman appeared in the rain, walking fast across her lawn from the house next door, and what she said to the sheriff's deputy standing by his patrol car would bring everything to a halt, would expose a fraud so calculated, so predatory, that within 48 hours, federal investigators would be on their way, and within 6 months, 17 people would be arrested for running a scheme that had stolen homes from elderly veterans across 3 states. But right now, in the rain, all Harold knew was that everything he'd worked for his entire life was being taken away, and he didn't understand why. 18 months earlier, Harold's life had a quiet simplicity to it, the kind that comes from outliving almost everyone you've ever known and learning to be content with your own company. He'd been a Marine in World War II, landed at Iwo Jima when he was 19 years old, and saw things he never talked about, not even to Rose. He'd come home in 1946, used the GI Bill to learn carpentry, and spent 41 years building houses for other people before he retired. He'd bought his own house in 1958, a small 2-bedroom bungalow with a front porch and a backyard big enough for Rose's garden. They'd paid it off in 15 years, never missed a payment, never asked for help. Rose died in 2011, and after that, Harold lived alone. His daughter Linda had died of cancer in 2003. His son Robert lived in Florida and called once a month, brief conversations that consisted mostly of Robert asking if Harold needed anything, and Harold saying no, he was fine. Harold had 3 grandchildren he barely knew and 2 great-grandchildren he'd never met. His family had scattered the way families do, and he didn't blame them. They had their own lives. He had his. At 101, Harold could still walk without assistance, though he moved slowly and carefully. His mind was sharp most days, a little foggy on others, but he could still balance his checkbook and remember phone numbers and tell you what happened at Iwo Jima in more detail than what he'd eaten for breakfast. He lived on his Social Security, $973 a month, and a small VA disability check of $212. His house was paid off, so he didn't have rent or a mortgage, just property taxes, utilities, food, medicine. He managed, just barely, but he managed. The house was old now, same as him. Things broke. The furnace died one winter and cost $1,800 to replace, which wiped out his savings. The roof leaked. The plumbing made noises. The foundation had settled unevenly over the decades, making the floors slope in ways that were probably concerning, but that Harold had learned to navigate. He couldn't afford to fix everything. Could barely afford to fix anything, but it was his house, the only thing he owned, the only thing connecting him to Rose, to his children when they were young, to the life he'd built.
In April, a man came to his door, said his name was Dennis Cowan, said he was with a company called Guardian Property Solutions, said they helped senior citizens with home repairs, property tax assistance, estate planning, said he'd been in the neighborhood and noticed Harold's house needed some work. Dennis Cowan was in his mid-40s, wearing a polo shirt with a company logo, carrying a clipboard and a friendly smile that made Harold think of a used car salesman. But then Harold felt bad for thinking that because the man seemed genuinely interested in helping. They talked on the porch for a while. Dennis asked about the house, about how long Harold had lived there, about whether he had family nearby, about his finances. Harold, who'd been raised to be polite, answered honestly. Said he'd been in the house since 1958, said his family was mostly gone or far away, said he lived on Social Security and didn't have much money for repairs. Dennis nodded sympathetically, said he understood, said that's exactly why Guardian Property Solutions existed, to help veterans like Harold. Dennis explained that they had a program. They could do the repairs Harold needed, the roof, the plumbing, the foundation work, and Harold wouldn't have to pay anything up front. Instead, they'd work out a payment plan based on what he could afford. Or, even better, they could do something called a property assessment lien, where the cost of the repairs would be added to the property as a lien that wouldn't have to be paid back until the house was sold. That way, Harold could get the repairs done, stay in his house, and not worry about payments he couldn't afford. It sounded good. Too good, maybe. But Harold was tired. Tired of worrying about the roof leaking every time it rained. Tired of the toilet that ran constantly and wasted water he had to pay for. Tired of trying to stretch $973 across a month's worth of expenses. And this man was offering help, offering to fix things, offering to let Harold stay in his house without the constant stress of things breaking down around him. So Harold said yes. Dennis came back 3 days later with paperwork, a lot of paperwork. Page after page of terms and conditions and legal language that Harold couldn't quite follow, even with his reading glasses on. Dennis explained it all quickly, pointing to where Harold needed to sign, saying it was standard stuff, nothing to worry about, just documentation for the lien and the repair work. Harold asked a few questions, as what the interest rate was on the lien. Dennis said it was minimal, just enough to cover administrative costs. Asked what would happen if he couldn't pay. Dennis said not to worry. The lien wouldn't come due until the house was sold, and that wouldn't happen until Harold either moved to assisted living or passed away, and even then his family would be able to handle it through the estate. Harold signed. He signed because he was tired, and because the man seemed trustworthy, and because he didn't have anyone to ask for advice, and because he wanted his roof fixed. Signed his name on line after line after line, his hand shaking slightly from the arthritis but still legible. Harold Jensen. Harold Jensen. Harold Jensen. The repair crew showed up a week later. 4 men in a truck with no company logo. They spent 3 days working on the house, fixed the roof, or said they did, fixed the plumbing, or said they did. Harold couldn't climb up to check the roof, couldn't see inside the walls where the plumbing ran. He just had to trust they'd done the work. When they finished, Dennis came by again, inspected everything, said it looked great, asked Harold to sign one more document just confirming the work was complete. Harold signed. Then nothing happened for 6 months. Harold's roof still leaked when it rained hard. The plumbing still made the same noises, but he figured maybe it took time for repairs to fully work, or maybe he was just noticing different problems now. He didn't call to complain, didn't want to seem ungrateful. In November, a letter arrived, not from Guardian Property Solutions, but from a company called Ironclad Holdings, LLC. The letter said that Harold's property had been transferred to their ownership due to default on a secured debt. It said he had 30 days to vacate the premises, or they would initiate eviction proceedings. Harold read the letter 4 times, didn't understand it. His property hadn't been transferred. He owned his house, had owned it since 1958, had the deed in a file cabinet in his bedroom. There was no secured debt. He'd signed papers for a lien, but liens didn't transfer ownership, did they? He didn't know. He called the number on the letter. The person who answered was cold, professional, impatient. Said that Harold had signed a deed in lieu of foreclosure, transferring ownership of the property to Guardian Property Solutions in exchange for the repair work. Said Guardian had then sold the property to Ironclad Holdings. Said the transaction was complete and legal and recorded with the county. Said Harold needed to vacate. Harold tried to explain that he hadn't signed anything transferring his house, hadn't signed a deed, had only signed papers for a lien.
The person on the phone said the documents clearly showed otherwise. Said if Harold didn't vacate voluntarily, they'd evict him. Then hung up. Harold sat in his recliner for a long time after that call, the letter in his lap, trying to understand what had happened, trying to remember what exactly he'd signed. The papers had been so confusing, so many of them, and Dennis had explained everything so quickly. Had Harold somehow signed away his house without realizing it? Was he losing his mind? Was this his fault? He called his son Robert in Florida, told him about the letter. Robert was skeptical at first, asked a lot of questions Harold couldn't answer, then got angry, said it sounded like a scam. Said, "Dad, don't sign anything else. I'm going to call a lawyer." But Robert's lawyer said it would cost thousands of dollars to fight this, thousands Robert didn't have. Said they'd need to review all the documents Harold signed, get an expert witness, go to court. Said even then, if Harold had actually signed a deed, there might not be anything they could do. Robert tried anyway, called Ironclad Holdings, demanded they send copies of the documents Harold had signed. They refused, said he wasn't authorized to receive them. Robert tried to get them from the county recorder's office, but the documents were hundreds of pages long, and the county wanted $3 per page to make copies. Robert couldn't afford it. The eviction notice came in January, filed by Ironclad Holdings, served by a sheriff's deputy who knocked on Harold's door on a Tuesday morning and handed him papers that said he had to appear in court or be evicted by default. Harold went to court, stood before a judge in a courtroom full of other people being evicted, mostly younger, mostly looking defeated. When Harold's case was called, the lawyer for Ironclad Holdings presented the deed, showed that Harold had signed it, showed that ownership had been legally transferred and recorded. Harold tried to explain that he didn't understand what he was signing, that he'd been tricked. The judge looked tired, said that failing to read a document before signing it wasn't a legal defense, said the deed was valid, said Ironclad Holdings had the right to evict, gave Harold 30 days. Harold didn't know what to do, where to go. He couldn't afford rent anywhere, couldn't afford to move. Robert said Harold could come to Florida, but Robert lived in a one-bedroom apartment, and Harold knew his son couldn't really afford to take care of him. Harold had outlived his friends, outlived his wife, outlived most of his family, and now he was outliving his home. The 30 days passed in a blur. Harold packed what he could fit in boxes: old photographs, Rose's wedding ring, his discharge papers from the Marines, the flag that had been on Rose's coffin. But most of his life wouldn't fit in boxes. Most of it was just going to be thrown away. The sheriff's deputies arrived at 9 in the morning on a day that was cold and raining. They were polite but firm, said they had to remove Harold from the property, started carrying his furniture out to the curb. Harold stood on the porch in his cardigan, watching his life end. And then Kelly Morrison appeared. Kelly lived next door to Harold. She was 46, worked as an accountant, had lived in her house for 8 years. She'd always been friendly with Harold, waving when she saw him, bringing him cookies at Christmas, shoveling his walk when it snowed because she knew he couldn't do it himself. She'd noticed the eviction notice on his door, had seen the sheriff's cars arrive, and she came over because something about this felt wrong. She walked up to the deputy standing by his patrol car, the one supervising the eviction. "Excuse me," she said, rain streaming down her face. "Can you tell me why you're evicting a 101-year-old veteran from a house he's lived in for 67 years? The deputy, a man named Williams, who'd been doing this job for 12 years and hated every second of it, said, "Ma'am, I'm just enforcing the court order. He defaulted on a debt, lost the property." "What debt?" Kelly asked. "Harold doesn't have debt. He owns his house outright." "Not according to the records," Williams said, pulling out the eviction order. "Property was transferred to Ironclad Holdings last year. They have legal ownership." Kelly's eyes narrowed. She worked with numbers, with financial documents, with legal paperwork. And this didn't sound right. "Can I see those records?" Williams hesitated,
then showed her the eviction order and the attached deed. Kelly read it quickly, her mind processing the language. Then she looked up. This is a deed in lieu of foreclosure. That's only used when someone is behind on mortgage payments and voluntarily gives up the property to avoid foreclosure. Harold doesn't have a mortgage. He paid off his house 40 years ago. Williams frowned. Well, it says right here, I know what it says, but it doesn't make sense. You can't foreclose on a property that doesn't have a mortgage, and you can't sign a deed in lieu of foreclosure if there's no foreclosure happening. She looked at Harold standing on the porch, looking small and lost. I think someone defrauded him. I think this whole thing is fake. Williams looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, I don't determine the validity of the court order. I just enforce it. Then don't, Kelly said. Not until someone verifies this is legitimate. I can't do that. Kelly pulled out her phone. Then I'm calling the news and a lawyer, and I'm posting this on every social media platform I have, because if you evict a 101-year-old World War II veteran in the rain based on fraudulent documents, that's going to be a story, a big one. William stared at her. He'd been doing this job long enough to know when something was off, and this felt off. He'd evicted people for legitimate reasons, people who'd stopped paying rent, people who destroyed property. But this was an old man who clearly didn't understand what had happened to him, being thrown out of a house he'd lived in for almost 7 decades. Williams had a grandfather who'd been scammed by telemarketers once, had given him their credit card over the phone thinking he was buying magazine subscriptions. Williams had never forgotten how helpless his grandfather had looked, how ashamed. He said, "Hold on." Then he called his supervisor. The supervisor said to proceed with the eviction, that they had a court order and had to enforce it. Williams said, "Sir, I think there's something wrong with this case. The neighbor is saying it might be fraud." The supervisor sighed, said fraud wasn't their problem, that if there was an issue, it needed to be resolved in court. Williams looked at Kelly standing in the rain, at Harold on the porch, at the furniture piled on the curb getting soaked, and he made a decision. "We're stopping," he told the other deputy. "What?" "We're stopping the eviction. I'm not comfortable with this. Something is not right." The other deputy looked relieved. He hadn't been comfortable either. Kelly was already on the phone. She called a lawyer she knew, explained the situation, sent photos of the documents. The lawyer said it sounded like a property theft scheme he'd heard about, where scammers targeted elderly homeowners, tricked them into signing deeds, then sold the properties. Said he'd make some calls, said don't let them remove Harold. Within an hour, 3 things happened. The lawyer filed an emergency motion to halt the eviction pending investigation of fraud. A local news crew showed up, alerted by Kelly's social media posts, and a detective from the county fraud division arrived, saying they'd received multiple complaints about Guardian Property Solutions and Ironclad Holdings and had been building a case. The detective talked to Harold, asked him to explain what happened. Harold told the story, his voice shaking, about Dennis Cowan, about the repair work, about the papers he had signed. The detective took notes, asked if Harold had copies of what he had signed. Harold said no. Dennis had taken all the copies, said Harold would get them in the mail, never did.
An American cinematic storyteller, the detective went to his car, made phone calls, came back 20 minutes later. "Mr. Jensen, I need you to know something. You're not the only one. We've identified 37 other cases in this county alone, all elderly homeowners, all veterans, all told they were signing papers for liens or repair contracts. All lost their homes." Harold felt dizzy. "I don't understand." "They're running a scam," the detective said. "They target elderly veterans, offer to do repairs, bury a deed transfer in the paperwork where you can't see it. You think you're signing for a lien, but you're actually signing over your house. Then they sell the house to a shell company, Ironclad Holdings, which immediately evicts you. By the time you realize what happened, the house is gone. Can I get it back?" The detective looked at him with something like pity. "We're going to try." The news story ran that night. Footage of Harold standing on his porch in the rain, furniture on his curb, 101 years old and being evicted from the home he'd lived in since 1958. The reporter interviewed Kelly, who explained what she'd discovered, interviewed the detective, who confirmed they were investigating Guardian Property Solutions, and interviewed Harold, who said simply, "I just want to stay in my house. I don't have anywhere else to go." The response was immediate. The story went viral. People were outraged. How could this happen to a veteran? How could scammers steal someone's home? Where was the oversight? Where was the protection? Donations poured in. Lawyers volunteered to take Harold's case pro bono. Veterans organizations got involved, and the state attorney general, facing enormous public pressure, announced a full investigation into Guardian Property Solutions and Ironclad Holdings. What they found was worse than anyone expected. Guardian Property Solutions was part of a network of companies running property theft schemes across 3 states. They'd stolen homes from hundreds of elderly veterans using the same playbook every time. Target veterans because their information was easier to find in public records, offer free repairs, bury deed transfers in complex paperwork, sell the properties to shell companies, evict the victims before they could get legal help. They'd made millions. Dennis Cowan was arrested in March. So were the owners of Guardian Property Solutions and Ironclad Holdings. So were lawyers who'd facilitated the transactions knowing they were fraudulent. So were county employees who had been bribed to rush the deed recordings through without proper review. 17 people total, all charged with conspiracy, fraud, elder abuse, and theft. Harold's case became the centerpiece of the prosecution. His lawyer, working pro bono, filed a motion to void the deed based on fraud, filed a lawsuit against everyone involved, and argued that Harold, at 101 years old, had been deliberately targeted because of his age and his cognitive vulnerability. The judge who had originally upheld the eviction reviewed the case again, saw the evidence of the scam, and reversed her decision. The deed was voided, ownership was returned to Harold, and Ironclad Holdings was ordered to pay Harold $300,000 in damages.
But Harold never saw that money. He died 4 months after the deed was returned, peacefully in his sleep, in his own bed, in the house he'd lived in since 1958. He was 101 years old, and in his final months, surrounded by his furniture that had been brought back inside, looking at photographs of Rose, he told everyone who visited that he was grateful. Not for the money, not for the media attention, but because Kelly had stood up for him, because Deputy Williams had stopped the eviction, because people had cared. At his funeral, Robert stood up and said something that made everyone cry. He said, "My father survived Iwo Jima. He survived the death of his wife, his daughter, most of his friends. He survived 101 years of life. But he almost didn't survive the cruelty of people who saw him as nothing more than an easy target. And if it hadn't been for one neighbor who refused to look away, he would have died on the street. That's not the country my father fought for, and we have to do better." The case led to reforms, new laws requiring witnesses when elderly people sign property transfers, new requirements for notaries to verify understanding, new oversight of property transfer recordings, mandatory reporting when someone over 80 signs a deed. It didn't fix everything, but it helped. Kelly Morrison still lives next door to Harold's house. Robert kept it, couldn't bring himself to sell. Sometimes Kelly stands in her driveway and looks at that house and thinks about the morning she walked across her lawn in the rain and refused to let them take away everything Harold had. And she thinks about how many people don't have someone who will stand up for them. How many people are right now being scammed, being stolen from, being thrown away by systems that should protect them. But she also thinks about how one person speaking up can change everything. How Deputy Williams could have just followed orders but didn't. How a judge can reverse herself when she sees the truth. How ordinary people can refuse to accept injustice and force the world to be better.
If you want more stories about people who stood up when everyone else looked away, people who refused to let vulnerable people be victimized, feel free to like this video. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And here's my question for you. Have you ever witnessed something that felt wrong and had to decide whether to get involved? What did you do? Do you think you would have done what Kelly did? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Because these stories remind us that we all have power. Power to speak up, power to refuse, power to say, this is not okay. And sometimes that's all it takes to save someone's life.